the Bain Free Radio Hour.
Hello and welcome to the Bain Free Radio Hour. Today we bring you the second half of Griffin Barber's interview of S.M. Stirling on The Winds of Fate, his latest entry in the To Make the Darkness Light series. After that, we jump into part 16 of the serialization of Mark Van Name's John and Lobo novel, One Jump Ahead.
Seed drills. If you use a seed drill, you only have to use a quarter as much seed to sow the same area.
Right.
And a seed drill is easy to make. They were made in the early 18th. The first ones were made in the early 18th century by Jethro Tull, not the band.
While it's easy to make, it's relatively easy to make, and that's one of the things you do quite well in that in the first book is talk about the where they're struggling to make it work because they're just trying to figure out the gearing and all of these elements, which none of them involve technology they can't make, but it does involve figuring it out.
Yeah,
so it's a good example of that B technology where we're going to have to give you some new concepts as far as gearing and that kind of thing. Although, I'm not sure if they did direct gear or direct drives for the water mills that they used.
They had a camming system, but
okay.
They didn't have crankshafts. Crankshafts were invented about 150, 200 years later, but
Okay.
They weren't widely applied for a long time. In The Winds of Fate, Artorias has started a ironworks. The Romans made iron in bloomeries.
Yeah.
They were about 7 or 8 feet tall and
That's a great episode of the Time Team is the one where they discover the field of bloomeries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
you've seen that one or not?
Yeah. The Imperial ironworks were the same as ordinary bloomeries. They were just had much more of them, and every one of them had a couple of slaves kneeling there, pounding away at the bellows, and then you had to take the bloom out and hammer it to get the slag out. It was incredibly labor intensive. Right. The Roman Empire produced about 80,000 tons of iron a year on a population of somewhere between 55 and 70 million.
Right.
And in 1776, the United States produced 35,000 tons of iron a year with a population of 2.5 million. And that makes an enormous difference. You can have like cast iron stoves and pots. You can use metal for tools much more, substituting it for wood, and it works more efficiently. And
gears, just gears or anything that's like a toothed thing that you need to exert a lot of force on, it's more resistant to that force.
Yeah. And the only way Romans could make a large piece of iron was hammer welding.
Right.
And that is fragile because there's often scale included in the hammer unless you're hammer welding, unless you're very careful, and it cracks. Jeremy, the guy who's trying to introduce a riding plow, keeps trying to use iron bars and they keep cracking and breaking. And finally he breaks down and just uses a balk of timber with iron straps around it. And that works.
Right.
Stuff like that. And spinning wheels.
Right.
They've got little scale models. Futch put them in the baggage. Scale models of spinning wheels, kick pedal looms with flying shuttles, and basic metalworking tools, like a basic metalworking lathe and a lens grinder.
Right.
Eyeglasses were invented in the Middle Ages. They've got a small lens grinder, and one of the things they do is they give Marcus Aurelius a pair of reading glasses because he's short-sighted.
Right.
And one of the things about Rome was that if the emperor was popular and he did something, everyone imitated him.
Yeah.
So he's impressed with forks. The Romans used spoons, and spoons with a sharp point on the other end for picking stuff out of dishes, but mostly they ate with their hands.
Right.
Forks are actually much more sanitary than eating with your hands. And Marcus Aurelius is impressed with forks because they make eating like a salad much neater and tidier.
So and they were resisted in medieval European society because of their association with the devil.
Yeah, or They were also resisted because they were associated with Italians who took them up first.
Mm.
And North Europeans didn't like Italians.
Right.
So the English resisted forks for 150 years. But in Rome, Marcus Aurelius takes up forks. And, well, of course, that's fashionable. Everybody takes up forks.
Right. When in
And,
Rome, when the emperor does it, we better do it too.
yeah, well, Romans wore beards or shaved, depending on whether the emperor wore a beard or shaved.
Right.
And Marcus Aurelius wore a beard. Everyone wears a beard. One of the time travelers thinks, and shaving hairs are like really unpleasant and dangerous. So, 3 cheers for DeBoss beard. Yeah, and all sorts of stuff like that.
Yeah.
There's a system for purifying drinking water. It's called a slow sand filter. You don't have to know why it works for it to work. You just have to put the water through a slow sand filter.
Right.
And sand is common, and it's the algae in the top inch or two that purify the water. And if you do that, you can drink the water safely.
Right.
Romans usually drank water diluted with wine whenever they could.
Yeah.
Because, well, that was safer.
Right.
If you drank water, you were taking a chance.
Yes.
You'd die in a pool of your own wastes.
Yeah.
Installing slow sand filters makes water safe to drink and safe to wash with. And basic stuff like that is extremely important.
Yeah.
My mother grew up before antibiotics. She was in her 20s when antibiotics were first introduced.
Right.
And she was like really careful about sanitation. I noticed that when I was growing up, that she was much more careful than my generation was.
Right.
And that was the reason. They knew about germs. They didn't have antibiotics. They were very, very, very careful about things.
Yeah. It's a good way to die. Yeah, I mean, it's a good way to die horribly.
Yeah, and
An
every
infection.
time you move into a new watershed, there's a new set of intestinal bacteria that you have to pick up, and that can be really dangerous too. So that was one of the reasons why travel was dangerous.
Right.
Yeah,
If you survived traveling somewhere, it was likely you were going to survive quite a long time because you had the constitution,
yeah,
to
yeah.
match those microbes.
Yeah, and microbes are all around you. Galen, the emperor's physician, gets germ theory handed to him, and there's a microscope. He can see the germs and that sort of thing. And then he reflects later on that once you've convinced a Roman that these tiny invisible things are all around you and waiting to infect you and kill you, some of the people he knew have fled to cottages in the mountains and glare at anyone who comes near them.
All right. Yeah, the unintended consequences are quite fun to explore too. The ways that people might go with something that might make it completely new and different is one of the more fascinating things I like about alternate history too. What the people will make of what they're given, because one of the things about these figures out of history and the unsung figures out of history is that they're people. They had thoughts, they had lives, they had considerations that we don't necessarily know about, but they are rooted in the same things we do. We have a drive to have sex, we have a drive to eat, we have propagate, etc.
Yeah, people weren't stupid in the past. I mean, Marcus Aurelius is obviously extremely bright, and so was Galen. They just didn't have as much information as we did.
Right.
But what you do with the information is also a matter of what you want to do. Romans were different from us. They'd never been Christians, for example.
Right.
So, for example, for us, revenge is a guilty pleasure. For a Roman, revenge was a moral obligation.
Yep.
There's a good historical novelist named Mary Renault. She worked in the 50s and 60s. And one of her books is set in Athens just after the end of the Peloponnesian War. And the guy, the protagonist, is a good person, and you identify with him. And then the 30 tyrants who ruled Athens after the Peloponnesian War assassinate his father. And he comes across his father dying, and his father paws at his wound and says, "Avenge my blood." And the young guy says, "Father, how could you think I should be so base of soul as to forgive my enemies?"
Right.
And that's the shock of a shock of difference. And Romans considered revenge on anyone who injured you or your kin to be a moral obligation,
Yeah.
and they really enjoyed it too.
Yeah, and it also gives rise to the whole client stuff too. So you're not only against me, but against my client. You're going to mess with my client, and that it
I mean,
feeds down and it feeds up.
patronage exists anywhere, but the
Yeah,
Romans raised it to the level of a system. Everyone was in some sort of chain of patron and client relationships, all the way down to the peasants,
yeah,
and you had to really take into consideration who was whose patron and who was whose client,
oh, yeah,
when you were operating, or you could get into really serious trouble.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, the deep water gets deep very, very quickly.
Yeah, and for example, there were Romans who thought that gladiatorial combat was a bad thing. But if you read them, they thought that it was a bad thing because it was bad for the spectators, not because it was bad for the gladiators.
Yeah. Yep.
You know, um, generalized empathy was not a great thing with Romans.
Oh,
Um, you know, that's one of the legacies of Christianity.
yeah. Well, and the other one with the general on the chariot with you when you had your triumph, die
Mhm.
now, die now.
Yeah,
That whispered words in your ear to this is
remember you
this
were
is
mortal.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's
And
amazing.
the Roman conception of a deity, of a god, was very different from ours because we're the products of monotheism. Um, but the Romans were more like Shintoists.
Hmm.
In Shinto, there's a hierarchy
Right,
of supernatural creatures. There's the spirit of a rock or the spirit of a tree,
right,
and then you go all the way up to Amaterasu, the sun goddess. But it's a graduation, and the classical paganism was actually rather similar to that.
right.
It's derived from animism, so that there's no really sharp distinction between humans and deities. There's just a
Yes.
gradual
Yeah,
gradual.
and you can see that in the way that the deities behave in the
Yeah,
myth, right? Because they're basically whatever societal norms that they want to talk about. This is the guy who's breaking all the rules. Why is he able to break all the rules? Well, it's because he is the patriarch of that family.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, very
And
interesting.
yeah, the one of the things that the time travelers introduce is historical linguistics. And Marcus Aurelius sees the argument, like Jupiter and Zeus Pater and
Right.
all that stuff.
Yeah,
And he's really taken with it, and he starts to write a book about it, so that like Latin and Greek are descended from a common parent. And um,
might buy off those Greeks because they didn't really accept
yeah,
that Latin was any better than theirs. They looked
when
down
I
on
was
them
in high
quite a
school,
bit.
when I was in high school, one of my friends was brought up a Lithuanian speaker. His family were refugees from Lithuania, and he opened the Rig Veda once, and he could get every third word in
Right.
the Rig, which was written in Sanskrit, and it was composed about 1500 BC, because Lithuanian is an extremely conservative Indo-European language. It's only about as different from Proto-Indo-European as Sanskrit is, even though that,
Really? Oh,
yeah, even though it's 3,500 years difference.
right.
Well, it's called peripheral conservatism. The Lithuanians were isolated up in the Baltic for a very, 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 very long time.
Yeah.
So even the grammar is actually fairly close to Sanskrit,
Hmm.
and he could make out phrases and individual words and that sort of thing from it. And that was one of the things that got me interested in historical linguistics. But um, the that's going to have an impact in the time travel stories too, because Latin is going to spread much more widely.
Right.
It's Latin replaced everything north and west of Greek, except for a few islands like Albanian and Basque.
Right.
Uh,
And Romosh.
yeah, and
Actually, I don't know if Romanche came in.
No, that was a development after.
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah.
And the Latin changed. Of course, all languages change, but it didn't start to split up into separate languages until after the fall of the Roman Empire.
Right. Which
You
is
know,
another argument for how easy it was to get around.
yeah,
Because
because linguistic innovations spread. There were regional accents, but they didn't become
break
separate.
apart. Yeah, they didn't separate.
And in my altered history, Latin probably remains a single language, although it will change. It had already changed by the second century. I made a note that Roman aristocrats spoke old-fashioned Latin, whereas ordinary people, like they pronounced Marcus, and by the second century, people were saying Marcu,
Right.
and eventually that became Marco.
Right.
Um, but that sort of change is inevitable in any language.
Right. And one of the things, and how to be cool in ancient Rome, right?
Yeah,
When you're talking, how do you differentiate yourself as a person while you're trying to talk to somebody or chat somebody up?
yeah.
That kind of thing, that repartee is going to be is going to heavily modify language. It's how it's happening now in English and every other language as well.
Yeah.
Uh,
If you look at
and
English spelling is actually quite phonetic, but it's quite phonetic for the way English was spoken 600 years ago.
right,
Like thought, we pronounce it as if it was spelled thot,
yeah,
but
yeah,
it was originally pronounced thucht,
yeah,
or sought was sucht.
yep, yep,
A great vowel change. If you read Henry VIII's letters and Elizabeth I's letters, you can see the change in the pronunciation. It was a period of very rapid change in pronunciation, and you can see it between father and daughter.
wow.
And
Yeah, I hadn't seen it that there, but I did know like the 17th century because doing some research for the Flint books, the 1632 books. You there's Peter, the Travels of Peter Mundy,
mhm,
who is a 17th century explorer. Really, he wasn't even an explorer; he was an East India uh,
mhm,
company man. But he went all over the place, and his spelling, is just all over the place as well. And then when he quotes somebody else, he includes their spelling errors, and
yeah,
because there was no standardized spelling for stuff. It was, do you understand what I'm saying? And part of the aspect of that was because I'm saying "thocht" instead of "thought." Uh, you know,
yeah,
it totally makes sense because now they're actually including the pronunciation of things that we no longer pronounce that way.
yeah. And the spelling got regularized right in the middle of linguistic upheaval, and it just stayed that way.
Right.
That's one of the reasons people find English easy to learn to speak badly and hard to spell,
Right.
because the spelling just has very little phonetic relation to the way it's actually pronounced now.
Yeah.
And English has a lot of words that are pronounced very similarly
Yeah.
now. But if you look at the spelling, you can see that they were originally very distinct.
Yep. Yep. For
So
sure. Yeah, I'm wondering about that because speaking Spanish as well, it's interesting to me how that is both impacted and changed by the Goths and the Visigoths and all that stuff where these different empires or kingdoms settled on those lands and
mhm,
modified the language and
yeah,
the regionalism in the language now. One of the most modern representations of this for me that was really, really interesting. Growing up, I lived in Spain when I was 5.
mhm,
And this was the year after Franco died and power had gone back to the democracy. I have newspapers from the first democratic elections there. But during his reign, you could not speak any of the regional languages. You were not
mhm,
permitted to speak any of them, and they almost died out by intent. He wanted to kill them. Basque, whatever it was, they didn't want to have you speak.
peddling policy, and yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So when I go back when I'm 15, the kids in the schools are learning those regional languages.
mhm,
When I go back when I'm 20, the menus are often in both languages.
mhm.
When
Yeah.
I go back when I'm 30, or actually closer to 40, 34, 35, uh, you have to find the Spanish speaking or the Spanish language on the menus. Like
Yeah.
it's not a given. The street signs are all in Quechua, they're all in Basque language, that kind of
Yeah.
thing. So a fascinating progress there of one empire trying to impose its will on everybody, not because they want to, but because it's trying to impose it on them. Right?
Yeah.
They don't want to emulate the court. They're being told they must.
Yeah.
How rapidly that changes, and that's just in geez, now it's 40 years, I guess, but
My mother spoke Spanish as a girl. She grew up in Peru.
right.
Well, her parents were English, but their families disapproved of the marriage because they were three social grades apart. This was they. My grandmother was a nurse, and my grandfather was gassed at Passchendaele, and they met in a convalescent hospital and eloped. And she told me once that they got an atlas and picked the country that was furthest from England that they could find. So they moved to Peru in 1918.
That's
And
a pretty good distance.
yeah, and my mother grew up speaking Spanish, but I was born in France in 1953. My father was stationed there with the Canadian Air Force, and they lived in a trailer because there wasn't any base housing. And when they wanted to go on a trip, they just hitched up the trailer and went. And one
Oh,
of the places they went was Spain, and there weren't many Latin Americans in Spain in the early 50s, just a few Mexicans. And one of the things my mother did was talk to the locals in her variety of Spanish, which was
right.
Peruvian. And the locals would try to figure out where she came from in Spain. And what they generally settled on was that she came from some little, very remote village up in the mountains on the border between Estremadura and Castile,
There you go. Yep.
because she spoke the equivalent of like the hill and holler Appalachian hillbilly
Yeah, totally.
English, and because Spanish in Peru was very old fashioned,
Right. Absolutely.
and she was effectively speaking Elizabethan Spanish, and that's what they figured out she was from.
Very cool.
Um, Later on, of course, you know that there are lots of Latin Americans in Spain now, and they'd know better, but at the time they didn't.
Well,
And in
that was
my
when I went back when I was in my 30s. I'd been a police officer for a while, and I spoke a lot. When I spoke Spanish, it was always with either South Americans or Mexican
Mhm.
in America. And the linguistic drift there with my own spoken Spanish when I had learned basically, well, I learned from a Cuban, and then I learned from, so I'm all over the map when it comes to how I speak my Spanish. But they all were talking about how, man, you sound like a Central or North American Spanish speaker, and not because I had a gringo accent, but because I had an accent that was more uh, a South or Central American to their ear.
Yeah, well, English has all sorts of dialects. I always enjoy talking to my Australian friends, and actually, Australian is very much like 19th century working class English, um, and so's New Zealander.
Yeah.
Yeah, languages just fascinate me.
Yep.
Yeah,
Well, it's especially when it comes down to writing and communicating these thoughts and ideas, across time and space, right?
yeah,
So let's get back to the whole winds of fate thing. So it carries us along through some intense battle scenes where the Roman legions and their auxilia fight the proxy war across Persia.
mhm.
Can you name some of the works you reference for these scenes or the book in general?
Um, I read up on the Parthian Roman Wars. Um, it was like a whale trying to fight a lion. Um, Parthian armies, field armies, were almost all cavalry.
Right.
They used infantry for defending fortresses and cities, but their field armies were almost all cavalry, and they were divided between heavy cavalry, who were armored head to foot, cataphracts. The
Right.
Romans. Uh, oh, and they used effectively what were like pikes on horseback. The Romans called them a contus, which
Yeah,
means a
the two-handed spear. Yeah.
two-handed grip. Contus means barge pole in Latin. That was soldier slang, and horse archers. And the Romans could beat Parthian armies, but they couldn't catch them. And the Parthians could inflict damage by coming in and out rapidly,
Right.
shooting showers of arrows, and then getting out of range. And General Fronto, who's a Roman general, actually was a Roman general. He was killed in the Marcomannic Wars in our history. He was governor of Dacia. When they march against the Parthians, they've got some cannon, and they've got catapults throwing bronze balls full of lead shot and gunpowder,
Right.
and they've got some muzzle-loading rifles. And he's virtually salivating at the thought that now he can strike them before they can strike him.
Right. Yeah.
And
The Parthians shot my ass.
yeah, exactly. And he's really delighted because he's beaten them before, but he just couldn't catch them before. Now he can hit them before they can hit him, and he's really delighted with it. And then they get to Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, which is right across from Seleucia. It's near Baghdad.
Right.
That area has had many capitals of Mesopotamia. That was their winter capital.
Right.
And Artorius has produced smoothbore cannon firing mortar shells, because mortar shells are what come out of a smoothbore tube in any case, and they blow up the wall, and the wall totters and comes down, and the Romans are just like dancing with, well, not quite dancing with glee. They've got gravitas, but you can tell they're really delighted at this.
Well, it's been how many years of wars on and off? They fought against, if not the Parthians themselves, then everybody who has ever been there. Basically, all the threats came from that way.
Yeah.
Up to this point.
Crassus in the late Republic fought the Parthians and got beaten
right
catastrophically. That was before they knew how to counter their tactics. And in the 2030s, the Sassanids, which were a Persian dynasty, took over Parthia after the Parthians got beaten quite a few times. The Romans beat them. They marched on Ctesiphon. They sacked Ctesiphon like 4 or 5 times, but they couldn't hold Mesopotamia because the Parthians were just too mobile. The Sassanids were a different kettle of fish. They were a more serious governing dynasty, and they and the Romans, and then the late Romans and the Byzantines, just fought each other to exhaustion, and that's what enabled the early Arab conquests in Muhammad's time.
Yep.
And in this one, the Romans just marched through Parthia because they can hit them from beyond the range they can shoot back with their arrows.
Right.
And
the reason why I was asking this question was because I was wondering if you hadn't done something with some of the British Empire's armies versus some of the native populations. Was if you hadn't.
Oh yeah. Well, Artorius says at one point that it's getting into scramble for Africa 1870s territory, where the technological gap is just like enormous. It's not Maxim guns against muskets. It's muzzle-loading rifles and cannon against spears and shields and bows. And that is a really considerable technological gap. And it has a shock effect. And in fact, it seems supernatural to most of the enemy soldiers. And
their horses.
Yeah, and their horses. And that encourages them to give up.
Right.
If you can shock people, defeating people is one thing, shocking them is another. Like at Omdurman in 1898, Kitchener commanded an Anglo-Egyptian force reconquering the Sudan from the Mahdist rebels. And the Mahdi had taken over in the early 1880s, and his successor was still running the place at that point. And they had a number of breech-loading rifles and stuff, black powder examples.
Yeah.
Kitchener's troops had Lee Metfords and Maxim guns. And at Omdurman, they suffered 48 casualties. Half of them were in the charge of the 21st Lancers, which was just like totally stupid. Cavalrymen, leave their brains behind. And the Mahdists suffered something like 15,000 dead.
Yeah.
because they charged very bravely right into the muzzles of the Maxim guns and the magazine rifles.
Yeah.
And there wasn't any more resistance for quite some time after that.
Yeah. Yeah, getting the stuffing knocked out of you and figuring it out, and adapting to the new technologies. I mean,
Yeah.
that's one of the things that eventually, usually people come around to going, oh yeah, that's a better way to do that,
Well,
or a more efficient way to do it.
weapons dictate tactics.
Yeah.
Modern armies disperse and conceal themselves and move in short bursts from cover to cover. But that's a fairly recent development. That started with breech loading rifles,
Yeah.
because that gave you enough rate of fire that you could stop a dense formation. Before then, morale had depended on marching shoulder to shoulder.
Yep.
And that had been true for a long, long, long time. And it was a terrible psychological um, trauma of up to and including the First World War, that that gradually made people realize that just wasn't practical anymore.
Right.
But officers were reluctant to admit that, because dense formations and being able to see everything that was going on were the core of discipline.
Yeah.
And you had to make soldiers self-motivated, and that was just more difficult.
Yeah, being able to see the standard and fight for the standard, work under the standard, see your
Yeah.
signaler, and all that kind of thing. Yeah. So, and I don't think that if radio hadn't come along as much as it did in the interwar period, that I still don't think we would have modified everything too much beyond what we did
Yeah.
for World War II. And the transition there, fire for effect, ammunition, all that stuff is all the air war. The combined arms whole concept is not possible without radio.
Yeah, my dad was a gunner in World War II, and he mentioned once that it was not a good idea after an action to go into the same bar as infantrymen.
Yeah.
And because 5 to 15% of our casualties in World War II were friendly fire,
Yeah.
or as he put it, artillery is approximate.
Yes.
And that was a product of the period from the 1890s through the 1920s. Indirect fire. You had to take guns out of the sight of the enemy, because otherwise they just slaughter you, and fire indirectly. But that meant that you had to have an observer far forward, and he had to be able to communicate with the guns. And then they brought in fire control centers and that sort of thing. And it was, but in the Winds of Fate, Artorias, who's a military historian among other things, can tell people what the tactics are appropriate for a particular type of weapon,
Right.
and convince them of it. By this time, he's gotten a lot
of credibility. Yeah.
A lot of credibility, a lot of mojo.
Yeah.
And he mentions that eventually the formations will have to disperse and shoot from shoot lying down and that sort of thing. And the officers are going, "What?
Yeah.
We will?"
Yeah. I'm interested to see how their gravitas, deals with that. You mean I'll take a knee, but I'm not going to lie down face first in the ground. Never.
Yeah. But a couple of demonstrations of why it's a good idea.
Yeah, right.
It's
but even so, I mean that gravitas is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Romans were extremely brave, but they were brave in a somewhat different sense than we are. And of course, legionnaires were professional soldiers. They enlisted for 25 years. They stood about a 50-50 chance of making it to the 25th year, in which case you retired and on a pension. Actually, 15 years salary you got at the 25th year, or a land grant.
Yeah, depending on what era of the.
Yeah, well, it depended on how much land was available, and
Right.
when expanding, it was land grants, because that was a lot cheaper, because you just taken it from the enemy. So,
and it was a way to colonize. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's easier to be brave shoulder to shoulder, because that's the way humans evolved.
Right.
it's harder to be brave when you can just barely see anybody else on your side and you can't see the enemy.
And you don't know what the hell's going on,
Yeah,
right?
in the Boer War, people were remarking that the battlefield was empty, and this was just like very, very strange. They regarded it as bizarre that you couldn't see the enemy. If
Yeah.
you look at popular representations of battles at the beginning of World War One,
Mhm.
um, they all show people in bright uniforms in dense masses clashing,
Yeah,
because that was what people thought of as
thought it was. Yeah,
battle, and it wasn't the case anymore.
yeah.
And
It
yeah,
wasn't just the generals who had that misconception. It was the
no,
artists,
it was everybody.
right? Yeah,
Actually, the only people who'd really absorbed that lesson to a certain extent were the British, but they lost their professional army in the opening battles. They did very well, but there
yeah,
were just very many of them.
right.
That's another thing that you have to bear in mind, is that if wars were fought without heavy casualties, long service professionals would win all the time.
Yeah,
But, you know, if there's going to be heavy casualties, you don't have the time to train people up to the same standard. That's why the Somme in 1916 was the way it was.
it's also the Marcomanni Wars, right? The legions were very much depleted by the actions of the war. You know, every
Yeah,
time
and
you
by
can
the
win every battle and still lose the war if you don't have enough warm bodies to replace your losses, right?
and the plague, the plague of Galen,
Right,
it hit armies and cities much more intensely than it did the countryside, because people were just packed together.
right.
That that actually that happened right down to 1918 with the influenza plague
Yep.
of that time. Um,
Yeah,
People
packed
packed
on troop
together.
ships on the way home too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Harry Turtledove did an interesting book. It's an alternate history where aliens invade in 1942. Have you read it?
I don't think I have, no.
Yeah, but one of the heroes is a baseball player who caught the influenza and all his teeth dropped out as a kid, and he can't get into the army because he's got no choppers. He has artificial teeth,
Right.
except that when the aliens invade, they reduce the standards and take him in.
Yeah, we don't need your dentures. Your dentures are okay. We're good.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, different times, different eras, and different methods of different tactics mean that you have to train people differently. Like in World War II, it was noted that a lot of soldiers didn't shoot or shot blindly, and they they investigated it and they found that it was the training.
Right.
And modern troops all shoot, or nearly, or all shoot, and shoot effectively in advanced armies, and that's because they're trained with pop-up targets that look like people.
Right.
So it's a conditioned reflex. Bam.
Yeah.
But in World War II, that was not the case, and certain people did far, far, far more damage than
Yeah.
you'd
I
expect.
mean, just look at Audie Murphy.
Yeah, like I knew someone whose father fought in the Commonwealth Brigade in Korea, and he was decorated. And he was asked why he volunteered for all the trench raids in the Indo and the static phase of the war, and he said, "I was bored. I don't like being bored." And in one case,
ADHD, anybody?
yeah, his unit staged a demonstration against the Chinese, and he rolled into a Chinese trench and went down it with a sharpened entrenching tool, and he killed 20 men in 10 minutes.
Mm,
Just bam, 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 bam down the trench. And I read the medal citation, and you could tell that his commanding officer really was nervous around this guy. And on the way back, on the troop ship on the way back, um, a petty officer started rating him about his uniform. He was, and the guy looked around. No one was watching, and he just grabbed the guy and chucked him overboard. And if he hadn't fallen past a porthole someone was looking out of, it would
oh,
have been mystery of the sea. They hushed it up
yeah.
because he attracted a lot of attention for getting the medal. But people with that outlook are
Yeah.
valuable in some circumstances, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. For sure. Well, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about as well, and we've ventured far afield. It's been a lot of fun. I wanted to talk to you about your collaborations in the past. I know you.
Okay.
I mentioned it at the outset about Dave Drake, and you were telling me before we started to record a little bit about some of the differences in style of the many collaborations that you've had. And could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Dave Drake did very detailed outlines for himself and, of course, for me when we were collaborating. He did 30 to 40,000 word outlines for stories of 120 to 140,000 words. So every scene was described.
Right,
And I found it oddly liberating. I could concentrate on description,
right.
and I didn't have to think about plot. And we did some good stuff, I think, the general series.
Oh yeah, those my favorites. They're on the wall behind me, behind the wonderful display of your cool cover here.
Yeah. So I also did a collaboration with Anne McCaffrey, and she sent me a page and a half outline for a book. Um, Different people approach that different ways. I don't do outlines myself. I'm a pantser,
Right,
but my my mind is fairly disciplined, and it produces. I go into a chapter, and I know after I'm in a page or two what I'm going to say in the chapter.
right,
Um, and McCaffrey was probably the same sort of writer I was. Dave Drake was very different. I find that if I do a detailed outline, it's harder for me to write the scene.
hmm,
Um, and I'm doing some collaborations now with you, among other people, and I'm doing fairly detailed outlines, chapter by chapter.
right,
And um, once I've done the outline, I don't feel an impulse to write it, if you
right.
know what
Yeah, yeah.
I mean.
You've already done the hard work for a pantser is the plot, right? It's
Yeah,
trying to get everything in that you want to, and the fun work is, as you were saying, was getting the descriptives in and the fun dialogue, that kind of thing. So
yeah.
uh, that's interesting. And then, but also you talked about the way you outlined with Parnell, which I found fascinating.
Oh, yes. I went and visited him and stayed at his house, and he had a half wolf dog, and we walked the dog up into the hills along the trails and discussed the um, the plot, and then I came back and made notes and worked from that.
Is this for the
Um,
prince?
hmm?
This is for the prince.
Yeah, for the prince, and that was interesting too. I liked working with Jerry, although sometimes he'd get upset about things I did. Um, Dave and I just worked seamlessly. Um, I think it was because the stuff we wrote was similar when it was finished.
Right,
We approached it in different ways, but the stuff was similar when we finished. Um, and when I was working with Anne McCaffrey, my actual text was quite different from hers, but I enjoyed using the background and the characters that she outlined. Um, yeah, the collaborations were fun. I was the junior, of course, in those collaborations, and I'm the senior now. There's going to be a trilogy set far in the future of this series, and I'm finding that quite interesting, seeing how the Romans adapt to interstellar travel.
yeah, for sure. I'm looking forward to seeing what the outline's like. I'm
Mhm.
guessing it's not going to be 40,000 words for 140,000 word.
Oh, 6 or 7,000 words.
Okay, there we go. That's a good
Uh,
short story.
yeah, um, a couple of paragraphs per chapter, saying what happens and how the characters interact and that sort of thing. Um, just extrapolating the Roman culture into the future is interesting too,
Right,
because it's not going to develop the same way as ours did,
right.
because the experiences are different.
Yeah, for
You know,
sure.
a unified world is not going to work the way that Western Civ did with all the different national groups. Although our competition between national groups is one of the reasons that Western Civ became so influential outside, because we got good because we had to, or you would be eaten alive by your neighbors.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. So
And
yeah, I'm looking forward to working with you. But also, I just very much enjoyed today. Got to get on with the questions though. Penultimate question: what, aside from your considerable entertainment value, do you hope readers will carry with them after reading The Winds of Fate?
um, that you can't always do what you want. Artorias retired from the army.
Right.
And at one point he says, how many times do I have to retire from the army before it sticks? Um,
He's Cincinnatus.
yeah, he doesn't particularly enjoy it. He does it because he does it because it's his duty.
Right.
And he's making war to make peace. Marcus Aurelius was the same way. He thought that Rome should rule everywhere because then that would ensure
Roman peace. Yeah.
Roman peace, the Pax Romana,
Yep.
and Roman law. Roman law was surprisingly advanced in many respects. Um, it, for example, the Romans didn't need a Woman's Property Act like the Victorians had because women could already own property in their own right. They
Yeah.
controlled their dowries, for example. If there was a divorce, they took the dowry with them.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, the Roman law was substantially advanced, but it was quite different from ours. Um, they didn't have the egalitarianism that our law presupposes.
No.
No, it's very, 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 very different outlook on things. Um, Roman hierarchy and the connections of patron and client were an important thing. And also, of course, Romans had a different attitude towards slavery than we did.
Right.
Um, most Roman citizens by the second century AD had a freed slave somewhere in their background. Even in the Senate, it was common. If you were a Roman's slave and the Romans set you free, which was quite common, manumission was common.
Yeah. There was a
Um,
mechanism for that, which was part of the
yeah,
way they maintained control.
yeah, and yeah, there was a 5% tax on it too.
Right.
Augustus introduced that. You became a Roman citizen. There were a few things you couldn't do, like you couldn't join the army, but your children were full Roman citizens if they were born after you were emancipated,
Right.
and they could do anything. And
And
it was
did.
quite common for freed slaves to become wealthy and for their children or grandchildren to become senators or equestrians.
Right.
Um, so the Romans didn't have any hangups about that. Now Greeks did. Greeks were very restrictive about citizenship. Pericles, the leader of Athens during a lot of the Peloponnesian War, he had a mistress by the name of Aphasia, and his son, he had to go through endless hoops to get his son Athenian citizenship. It
Right.
was very difficult for him, even though he was one of the most popular leaders in Athens. So Greeks had a very restrictive attitude towards
Right.
their citizenship. If you were a Greek slave and you were freed, you weren't a citizen. At best, you could become a metic, a resident alien.
Yeah.
And Galen, one of the Greek characters in this book, reflects that that's possibly the reason Rome rules Greece rather than Greece ruling Rome.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
For sure.
because the Romans thought that anyone could become Roman. And it was their history too. Like Romulus and Remus founded Rome as a settlement of refugees, escaped slaves, half peasant, half bandit guys,
Right.
and they knew that. That was part of their founding mythology.
Yeah. And they
That
didn't try and hide it or bury it under.
oh
Yeah.
no, they were quite upfront and open about it. That Romans started out as a bunch of thuggish refugees,
Yep.
behind a palisade on the top of the Palatine Hill,
Yep.
and they were quite proud of the fact that they had come from being refugees and uh, bandits to becoming rulers of the world.
Right. As you one would.
Yeah, but
So, so the last question here then is, what conventions can your fans hope to catch up with you at? And what other work do you have in the pipeline? We've already talked about a little bit about collaborations and stuff, but we didn't talk about your individual stuff. Hopefully the third book in this series.
oh yes, I'm working on the third book now. I taking some time off to do the outlines for the collaborations, but the third book in the series is going to be called The Hammer of Destiny. and it's going to resolve the situation with or partially resolve the situation with the Chinese time travelers. They're in a more vulnerable situation, really, and um, nobody in China knows that they're from the future.
Right.
A few
Adds to their
people,
vulnerability, right?
a few people in Rome know that the Americans are from the future.
The right
Galen,
people, the correct people needed to know that.
Marcus Aurelius, and the merchant who discovered them, who was puzzled by a lot of things about them. One of them was that they had all this baggage and there were no tracks of carts, but it was obviously that they just arrived because some of the cartons tipped over while he was watching,
Right.
and he couldn't figure it out. And they were all like really, really tall.
Yeah. Not a twisted leg in the bunch.
Yeah, and they had like surprisingly good teeth. One of the things that Romans had was bad teeth. They ate a lot of bread. They got plaque. They got cavities. And rich Romans had worse teeth than poor Romans because they could afford more sweets.
Right. Yep.
Honey,
Add
which,
sugar to the mix.
yeah. So then he notices that they're all well fed and they look as if they've never gone hungry, which means they're well to do. But they have interestingly fine white teeth.
Right.
He pushes back the lips and looks at they're unconscious when he.
Right. Yeah. I remember. Yeah, that's one of the exceptional things again about alternate history is playing with that idea. And when in comparison to somebody that's like from a different culture where they're not having the bread, they're going to have better teeth because they're not
Oh
having
yeah,
from that kind of thing. But they'll have other issues from what it is their diet is, right?
nomads who lived on milk and meat would have better teeth because
Right.
that's the diet we evolved for.
Right.
They've done stable bone isotope ratio analysis on Paleolithic skeletons, and they find that hunter-gatherer humans ate virtually nothing but meat.
Right.
They ate the whole animal. They ate the organ meats as well.
Yeah.
You have to do that to avoid deficiency diseases.
Yeah.
But I think we maintained a capacity to digest vegetable foods as a fallback in times of like droughts and stuff.
Right.
We're apex predators and have been for a long time. Even Homo erectus hunted hippopotami with wooden spears.
Right.
They've discovered that recently.
Right.
And, so we were just more we humans were just more effective apex predators than any of the competitors.
No,
We
for
had a
sure.
couple of mutations that deal with language that Neanderthals and others didn't have, and it apparently makes it easier for us to talk.
Right.
And
Yeah, something about the structure, even the mouth structure, the palate structure, something
yeah,
like
mouth palate structure and some of the
brain. Yeah.
genetic connections in the brain, and that made it easier for us to talk. Neanderthals were probably quite smart. They had brains the same size as ours,
Right.
but they weren't as good at communicating. And communication is, the foundation of social organization.
And hunting is a lot easier in packs than
Oh
otherwise.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Because do you know that the one thing that humans can do better than almost any other animal?
Hmm.
Run long distances
Oh yeah. No, I knew that one.
at
But
medium speed,
yep.
and that was evolved for chasing down prey.
Yep. Tiring it out. Yep.
Yeah, and we sweat, and our cooling system is more efficient than any other animals.
Yep.
Like,
Because of that. Yeah. For that
yeah,
purpose. Yep. To keep it
most animals can only sweat through their mouths.
Yep.
Mammals, at least. We can sweat from all over our body, and it.
As a sweater, I'm going to say yes, we can. So, all right, what conventions can we see?
Oh, I go to my local convention, which is Bubonicon. It's named after the bubonic plague, which is endemic among rodents here, and that's at the towards the end of August.
Okay.
And I'm going to go to DragonCon, which I always go to every year. And I really enjoy DragonCon. One of the reasons is that there's a lot of young people there, and it's got a lot of energy. As
Yeah.
I said, I stopped going to Worldcon when I realized I was usually the youngest person in the room, and that was a bit daunting.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a bit of a challenge. And so, other work that you have coming up, you said you paused on the third book in this.
Yeah, I've got about a third of the book done, the third book done. As soon as I get your outline done, I'm going to go back to finishing it. I think I'll probably have it finished by the end of the year. Usually
Oh,
takes me a year to write a book.
okay.
The speed varies. At times I can write 10,000 words a day, at times a couple of hundred. Speeds up, goes back. And then I, polish it. I'm going to be polishing the collaborations too.
Right.
Yeah. Um, you know, one of the things you learn as you write is how to do things more effectively. I picked up a lot of stuff from writers of a previous generation, like Paul Anderson taught me that if you want to make a scene more vivid and immediate, you use all the senses,
Yes.
just vision, but smell, touch,
Smell. Yeah.
physical sensations,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. And he did that very effectively.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if nothing else, I'm a huge fan of smell because it's one of the keys to memory.
Mhm,
Generally, it's one of the biggest things and that's one of the biggest advantages of books over television
mhm.
is that in describing the smell of something, you
Yeah,
can access the reader's memories far more ably than just showing a scene because not everybody's had to smell a corpse or a
mm,
corpse at a certain age, that kind of thing. They're not going to have done that. But in reading it, they can go, oh, and you have this kind of vinegary scent that goes along with it. And, you add in those different elements. They, oh, wait, now I get you.
yeah,
And,
exactly. Smell, touch,
you know,
um, all sorts of sensations, um, and the things like, for example, pre-industrial cities stink. They really, really, really stink.
and
But
early industrial cities really, really stink for entirely different reasons.
yeah, well, actually, there was a bit of an overlap in the early
Yeah, it
19th
is.
century.
Yeah. Yeah.
But um, people noticed it when they went into a city, and then they gradually noticed it less and less because you become accustomed to smells.
Right.
And then if you went out and then were in the countryside for a while, and then you went back into the city, you thought, "Oh my God, how did I not notice this?" And then gradually you become accustomed to it. Um, Roman cities would be better smelling than European medieval or early modern cities
Right.
because they had aqueducts and they had sewers.
Right.
Um, Not that the Romans knew that this promoted health, but they just liked being clean.
Right.
Of
And
course,
having water come to them
yeah, if
was easy.
if
Yeah.
if you went to a Roman bath, you were bathing with potentially infectious people.
Right. For sure. Well,
Yeah,
thank you so much, Stephen. This has been a great time. Thank you for coming on the Bay Free Radio Hour and talking about the Winds of Fate,
yeah.
which will be available on July 2nd, I think.
July 1st or 2nd. Yeah,
Yeah, it's
one
the,
or the
the
other.
first Tuesday in July, in any case.
Yeah,
Uh, I hope everybody will run out and get it. And I certainly look forward to working with you and seeing you more and talking more books and more history because this has been it's one of my favorite things to talk about. If that wasn't already apparent, is history and especially when you can combine that with science fiction, it's a lot of fun.
yeah.
So
Time travel
yeah,
is a great thing,
yeah,
literary wise. Look me
yeah.
up at Dragon Con.
And now, as promised, one jump ahead. John Moore is a nanotech-enhanced soldier of fortune. Lobo is an AI, a living weapons and intelligence platform of enormous destructive potential. Two very dangerous wolves in a galaxy of deadly corporate and paramilitary predators. But Moore has grown weary of the killing, and just once he'd like to finish the job without leaving a trail of blood behind him. Not going to happen. Not on a pristine planet called Macon, where two gigantic corporations vie for control of the local jump gate and access to the riches of an undeveloped world. Dealing with a kidnapping and extortion scheme is only the beginning for Moore and Lobo as they work to stay one jump ahead.
Humanity learned these facts the hard way. Now every gate has an associated refueling and scheduling station that monitors and controls all jumps through it. Low-energy beams, such as radio signals, pass right through apertures and stay in the same local space, as if the apertures weren't there at all. We don't know why they don't make the jump, but they don't. Thus, the gates provide instant transportation, but not instant communication. Of course, firing a high-energy beam, such as a laser pulse at an aperture, will bring immediate and fatal retaliation. So no one's running any more experiments in this area. Every single gate has proven to be relatively close to, but not easily visible from a planet suitable for humans. Some gatists say the gates are material manifestations of God's desire for us to colonize the universe. Others claim the gates are God, or at least physical aspects of God. Most people are simply glad to have the gates, though many fear that one day those who made them will come back and demand a toll. I know the gates work, and that's good enough for me. Each gate glows a single color, every spot on its surface the exact same hue as every other spot. The gate perched behind Macken's smaller moon, Trethin, and silhouetted against a bright stellar background, was a very pale green that I found to be a nice blend of the colors of the planet's oceans and forests. Most gates were far bolder, less natural colors. I've seen a blazingly pink gate. If nothing else would have stopped me from being a gatist, that would have done it. I can't picture myself ever worshiping something pink. As I stared at Macken's gate, I felt the same humble amazement I did each time I neared one. This gate currently had only 3 active apertures. The entire structure dwarfed Lobo, each aperture big enough to permit the passage of a ship 10 times Lobo's size. Off to my left, I could see the new aperture growing. It was currently small enough that Lobo wouldn't come close to fitting through it, its surface the dull gray nothingness of all new apertures. When it was ready, the aperture would turn the purest of blacks. The color space would be if there were no stars. Pass through the aperture, though, and you'd be in another part of the universe with a different set of stars shining before you. The scheduling station told us that a couple dozen ships on our side and as many on the other were ahead of us in the jump queue, so we had about 12 hours to kill. Lobo was set for fuel, his reactors able to run for decades without intervention. So I decided to dock and see if I could pick up any interesting news in the station's main lounge. Every gate station runs one. In the bigger gates, the lounges are recreational complexes bordering on hotels with rooms available by the hour or the day, bars, restaurants, gyms, and stores selling crap planetary souvenirs at inflated prices. With only 3 apertures, this station didn't have enough traffic for anything so elaborate to be able to turn a profit, so the lounge amounted to a restaurant-bar combo with room for maybe 50 folks. A couple dozen were there when I entered. I spent more than a day's food budget on Macken to buy a bottle of water and a sandwich made of some local fish with a firm, meaty consistency. At a table in the back corner, I ate slowly and tuned as best I could into the conversations around me. Some of the monitors scattered on the room's walls blared the official local news, which I didn't trust, but watched now and again anyway. Other displays showed the ships coming and going through the apertures. To my surprise, the sandwich was good.
This has been the Baen Free Radio Hour. Thanks for joining us at the heart of science fiction.
Join us next week as Sean Haslett interviews Michael Merceau on his latest book, The Presence Malign, which completes his trilogy, The Deep Man. And later, we continue with part 18 of One Jump Ahead by Mark Van Ney.
Score by Ruth Judkowitz.